This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Karina Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Karina Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Joining us now in studio is Democratic nominee for Maine's 2nd Congressional District and Maine State Auditor, Matt Dunlap. Welcome back.
It's great to be back.
We appreciate it.
So what are you hearing out there now that you're the nominee?
Oh, it's a very different world. One of the things that has really struck me between the primary campaign and the general election campaign is people really do sit back to watch to see what happens in the primary, and people don't weigh in, and how the doors just open once you're the nominee. And in social ways and in terms of fundraising especially, we've raised as much money in 1 month as we raised in the fourth quarter. People approaching us, and it's really quite humbling actually when somebody you have no idea who they are, they're not part of your program, and they send you online a maximum contribution. One of our consultants said back in the day, you could lie to people and say, look, I just need that one last contribution to put me over the top, and then you finish 5th in the 3-way primary. But now they research and they see that if you're viable and you are carrying a message they believe in, you don't even have to ask. They just send the money. One of my contributions, which I find for some reason most gratifying, and I can't really explain why, we had a house party down the mid-coast, and one of the hosts handed me a check. She said, the woman couldn't make it. 101 years old, has the Boston Post cane for her town, gave $50. That was very meaningful to me. But socially, too. I mean, people approach you differently. We went out to dinner one night. It took me 10 minutes to get to the table because everybody wanted to talk to me. There's something about winning that is a little bit contagious with folks. So it makes everything a little bit easier. And of course, it's just gone so much faster now. There are no off days, and I'm up by 6 o'clock every morning and right at it. So it's a lot of fun. It can be terrifying at times, but it's going well.
Speaking of the primary, you must have went to bed with a few votes behind.
That was a tough night. We were dumb. We had a watch party. Because with ranked choice, you're not going to know unless you're like running away with it like Graham Plattner did in his primary. He had 73% by 9 o'clock. When we called it at about 11:45, I was in third place with 38% of the returns in. And we got home and we just sort of looked at each other and said, it's over. In third place, I can't jump. So I woke up the next morning and thought, well, we ran a great campaign. We raised a great amount of money. We made great contacts with people, nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, quite proud of the campaign. And now go back to work as state auditor and just figure out the next few years before I ride off into the retirement sunset, if that's the way it's going to be. Probably never will retire, but you know what I mean. And I thought, well, let's just see how bad it got overnight. So I got my phone and, we were in second place. And that was a much different place to be in. And my wife came downstairs. I was like, maybe we called it a little early. And I said, well, it's 49% in. Let's not get too comfortable. But that's the way it worked. And we sort of figured that based on the way we conducted the campaign, that a lot of Page Loud's second place choices would come to us. And that all we had to do was really split it with Jordan Wood. And I had a good chance to win. And that's pretty much how it played out. We wound up coming out ahead of Jordan by 305 votes. And most of his second choices went to me. And I was able to win by over 3,500 votes over Joe Baldacci. So everything just, like I say, took off from there. There was no real break after that.
Now you brought it up, Graham Plattner. What are your thoughts on that entire situation?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of doctorates awarded in political science about that campaign. He just emerged out of nowhere. He took center stage. It really did. We say it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. We had a rally the Friday before the primary with Congressman Ro Khanna, who had endorsed him and me and Troy Jackson down in Bar Harbor. It's kind of weird being in the movie theater that I grew up going to. It was electric. There must have been 800 people there, all the national media. Sunday Telegram covered it. And Troy and I got a little brief mention. 3.5 pages with Graham Plattner. It was almost historic. And then it just came crashing down within hours of the publication of that political story about the sexual assault allegation. We're still kind of figuring out what happened there. You know, we don't know the entire story. He withdrew from the campaign, which I think was the right thing to do for him and his family. But then, of course, there was a whole rush to replace him as a candidate within that 2-week framework. And what they came up with a process, I was quite fearful that there were just too many moving parts. And all you need is for one county caucus to go sideways and it throws the whole thing in the woods. But it came off. It was actually fairly smooth. I think people more or less trusted that process. It was not simply a decision made by the party chair or the state committee. They brought people in. Something like 6,000 people applied to be delegates. And it went very quickly and smoothly. And Troy Jackson was able to consolidate a lot of support very quickly with the help of the unions and some other folks. And now we have a nominee, and hopefully we can get back to a normal campaign cycle. I've been saying not jokingly, that when I began to form this idea over a year ago now, it seemed like the strangest thing that was going to happen this election cycle was that the state auditor was going to challenge the incumbent congressman in a primary. And so far, that's been the one thing that's made the most sense. Everything else has just been nuts.
So you must have looked over your shoulder and probably thinking way back, boy, did I say anything or do anything?
A long time ago. When I first ran for the legislature, I had that terrifying exercise because I'd never been interested in politics. I'd just been living my life. And I had to think, okay, high school, college, when I worked in commercial kitchens or the print shop or at my folks' textile business, was there anything I said or did that somebody could wave around and say, this guy isn't who he says he is? And I really wasn't able to come up with anything. And in fact, when some of the story began to emerge about the social media posts that Plattner had back in October, which people gave him grace for, my wife said, are you sure there's nothing out there that you've forgotten about? And I was like, I go through my head about it every day. I've never had an OUI. I've never stolen anything. I've never been fired from a job. I've never had an affair. I don't have any weird fetishes that people know about or anything like that. I don't have any weird fetishes that people don't know about. I haven't even had a speeding ticket since 1997. So that really pays off when you're running for a political office, being a little bit boring, not having that salacious past that you have to answer for. And again, that's, I think, a lesson to a lot of people. If you got something like that in your background, think twice about getting in.
Speaking of fundraising, where do you stand with the DCCC? Where's that relationship going?
It's slower than we'd like. We talk to them every single day. There's a regional director that we communicate every day with. In fact, right now, while I'm sitting here doing this, we're having a team meeting with our consultants, and he's sitting in on it, that regional director. So they're part of our program. They haven't swept us into the Red to Blue program yet, and that's their process. Like I say, we're in contact with them. We're doing very well. There's no reason why we shouldn't have their support, and I think we're going to get that support. Compared to where I am in relation to other races around the country, I think we're better positioned. We did a poll, Tulchin Research, which is a very well-known national polling firm, and they're not cheap, but they do honest work. We used them first in March. We wanted to have a scientific poll. Really, where are you? And of course, they sent me all the questions they were going to ask people. I hated the questions they were asking about me, and my campaign manager was like, Matt, these guys are pros, trust them. And what we got back was really informative. We knew what issues were going to resonate with people and what issues were not in terms of the background and voting records and things like that. So this time, again, they did another poll, 600 people, about a 4% plus or minus margin of error, and showed that I was up by 1 point. Having a jump ball in the middle of July is a great place to start from. It shows that we're very competitive. Our fundraising has been strong. So I'm very confident that the national folks will partner with us fairly soon. And that will help us even more as we get into the fall campaign.
Did they give you a checklist that you have to meet?
Well, they've talked to us about some things they want to see. They want to know what our campaign, how it's built, and what the structure is, what our budget is, what our plans are. And I think part of that is they have spent a lot of money. And here we are, not even to Labor Day yet, because they were involved in that Supreme Court case in Virginia, which was unsuccessful. And they've invested in other primaries where their candidates did not prevail. So I think they're being a little bit cautious. I don't know that. I'm speculating, but it would make sense to me that you would marshal your resources carefully.
So you're talking about that poll. What did the people come back as the most important things in their lives that they're looking for?
It's the economy, bottom line, and that's the umbrella. But the number one thing that I've heard about since day one is access to health care. People are very worried. And that was back in October, before the Affordable Care Act tax subsidies expired at the end of December. And it's just gotten more so. Housing is a huge concern for people. I work with an office full of professional people, one of whom, a young woman, she's a single mother, and she can't afford to buy a home. And we pay her pretty well. But the cost of housing has just really spiraled. I remember when we bought our house, which was a while ago now. I think we paid like $78,000 for it. And I was terrified. How am I going to pay for this place? If we were to buy it now, it would probably be $450,000, which would probably be out of reach for us. But housing, healthcare, childcare. I called a friend of mine that I'd done some work with about the campaign. And he said, we can't afford to have a second child. My daughter, who's like 3 months old, is in daycare. It's $275 a week. And that's more than the mortgage on my trailer. So we just can't afford childcare. In Old Town, I'm sure it's true much across the state, you have a lot of grandparents who are now raising children because of the opioid crisis or because of some other disaster in the family. They got to go back to work and they could use a little help. So the cost of living, of course, the war in Iran has just driven up the cost of everything. And the thing I worry about, because I know people in Old Town who live on fixed incomes. And when I was in the legislature, every once in a while, I'd swing through McDonald's to get a cup of coffee on the way down. And I'd see the same group of people there every day. They were there for the senior discount coffee, to be sure, and the social aspect also. But they also turned their heat off during the day. because they couldn't afford to heat their homes. And this is almost 30 years ago. And with heating oil knocking on $5, $6 a gallon, if you can get it, we don't know what's going to happen with this whole thing. Now, the Houthis are blocking the Persian Gulf, along with now the Iranians in the Strait of Hormuz, which is where a lot of the world's oil passes through. The prices are just going to go up. And I think that's something that people are very, very concerned about because they see it in their grocery bills. A friend of mine was going to buy a new laptop, had to put it off because it had gone up $200 because of the Canadian tariffs of all things. So these are approaches that are really affecting people, and that's what they're talking about to me.
Speaking of housing, I was talking to a few people about the capital gains tax. Like you said, if you paid $80,000 for your house and because of inflation, it's $400,000. I think the capital gains is at $250. If you got in, would you try to raise that so we can get some cycling of houses?
I think that's important. If you have a situation where your grandmother lives on the family farm and it's 800 acres of prime real estate, capital gains is really going to whack that family if they ever have to sell the farm. But yeah, raising that. And also, too, we talk about raising things. It's all geared towards the upper middle class penalty, really. So you take like Social Security. The contribution levels are capped at $180,000. And one of the top things we hear about are concerns about the viability long-term of Social Security. Well, if you took that cap off and somebody making $50 million a year was paying proportionately, you would not only probably make Social Security viable for the long term, but you could actually expand the benefit base. I've been actually surprised with myself that I didn't really realize how many people depend solely on Social Security when they retire. Not that I'm a financial wizard. I don't think I could balance a checkbook until I actually got my certification as an auditor. But every place I've worked where there's a retirement plan available, I've enrolled in it. You know, as in TIAA, CREF at the university, I signed up for the 457B plan at the State House, state retirement. I'm not going to be wealthy when I retire, but I'm not going to rely on just Social Security either. But so many people do, and now they're looking at incomes of $1,500, $2,000 a month when their property taxes are $6,000 a year. I think that's something that we can address without really causing a lot of pain at all. But capital gains, like you say, that's something that could help families when they are making the move. If their $75,000 house is now $450,000, it may impede their ability to buy another home because they have to pay so much in capital gains. So I think we should look at that too.
I don't think it's been changed since 1997, and it should be indexed to inflation.
Many things should be that are not. We even did that with legislative pay. We indexed it to the consumer price index because raising legislative pay is like one of the least politically popular things you could ever do. But I had a conversation with the Speaker of the House in New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire has the third largest deliberative body in the world in their House of Representatives, 400 members. And he said, if I could change one thing about our legislature, it'd be legislative pay. They pay $200 a year. That's it. So the people that can afford to do it are retirees. He said, we have more funerals. We actually have a budget line for flags to put over coffins. And ordinary working people can't afford to run for the legislature. And that's less true in Maine. And then they have raised the pay quite a bit. But when I was there, it was $9,000 a year. I had to work nights at Pat's Pizza when I was chair of the Fish and Wildlife Committee so I could pay my share of the bills. That's tough to ask of people in public service. So they finally indexed it to the consumer price index. So now you're still not getting rich, but you don't lose money either. I think that's important.
Well, let's pivot to our rural hospitals. As you know, they are closing. OB units are closing. What would be your plan if you were elected to Congress to at least assist on the federal level?
We talked about that a lot today, actually, at this taping. It's the anniversary of the signing of the Social Security Act of 1965, which created Medicare, Medicaid. 61 years. And these are programs that have great challenges in Congress, as H.R. 1, the big, beautiful bill, which cuts trillions from Medicaid, Medicare. And I think as we talk about how we fund healthcare, it's not just the coverage. That's not the only issue. It's the access to care, especially in rural Maine, where you have a lack of access to clinics. Hospitals are under great financial strain. And now with the ACA subsidies expiring, is in the paper today. So many people are going to emergency rooms and hospitals are just eating it. And they can't afford to eat it. They have to find a way to pay for that care. And I think absolutely Congress has an affirmative role to make sure the resources are available and prioritized to not only support people's access to health care through what I would hope for, some type of a universal system like a Medicare for all system. And if you had something like that, you would be less reliant on emergency rooms, Medicaid. The Affordable Care Act was a half measure. It gave people access to the commercial market. It didn't really provide universal care. People still pay for it, just at a reduced rate. So it's a bit of a Rube Goldberg machine that you try to cancel out competing factors. But if you just had a system where we could collectively, like we do with our schools, have a way to pay for these things and pay for the institutions that house them so that it's not an economic risk of closure. The birthing centers in particular are of great concern. Childbirth can still be a very dangerous thing. And the 2nd District has had one of the highest infant mortality rates in New England. So this is incredibly important. And I do think that we need to address the financial viability of our rural hospitals and clinics. And as you build that out, if I was king for a day, who knows what I could put together. But you have VA clinics, which are an incredibly important service point. If you had like a universal healthcare system, you could embrace that and fold it in to provide additional access for people who might otherwise not have it. So I'm hopeful that we can work on that.
So how would we fund that? Through federal taxes?
This is a question that we get. And I have an old school friend of mine. We were talking about this. He said, Matt, I'm pretty conservative, but I'm with you on healthcare. He said, and the thing that frustrates me and a lot of people like me is that whenever we talk about things like providing healthcare, universal healthcare, et cetera, the first question that comes up is how do you pay for it? We don't question how we pay for aircraft carriers going to the Middle East. It's how you prioritize things. And I've been through many budget cycles in the legislature, and it is a very, very difficult prioritization process. But we already pay a Medicare assessment. We pay for Medicaid through our tax dollars, and the rest of it comes out of our own pockets. So I think if you restructure that entire system, you wouldn't be as reliant on Medicaid if you had a more robust universal access point through Medicare. There's a concern that we'd be outlawing private insurance. Absolutely not. I have a friend of mine who's visiting right now from Australia. He was from Bangor. He's in town for a few days, helping his family with some stuff. He said, we have Medicare for all in Australia, but we also have private insurance. You can kind of dovetail these things quite nicely depending on what your needs are. But basic healthcare access, a slip and fall on the ice should not make people fear bankruptcy. They should not be cutting their pills in half because they can't afford prescription drugs. And I think that's really where we want to address that most profound need.
So do you support the platform of the DSA?
I really have not paid much attention to the DSA. This is one of the questions I got early on about the campaign as I was approaching it with Congressman Golden. They said, are you going to run to the left of him or to the right of him? And I said, really, I'm just going to run as Matt Dunlap. And one of the problems I find with these coded labels, progressive, socialist, conservative, whatever, is that it's very black and white. And really, most people who approach public policy do so in a much more nuanced way. I'm a Democrat. And this is one of the things I've always said is that the Republicans, when I was Secretary of State especially, they watched me like a hungry hawk hovering over a big fat mouse hole, waiting for me to make a false move. And that's called accountability. That's what that process is there for. But I always felt like after the election, the party labels should go away and just try to help people. So I always worked very well as a legislator with Republicans and independents, Democrats. And in terms of my political makeup, it's a little screwy because I am a Democrat. I tend to describe myself as more of a Franklin Roosevelt New Deal Democrat than anything else. And that's not outdated. These are the things that we are talking about. We're talking about healthcare issues and hospitals and the cost of living and what the world is that people face when they get up every day. Working families and helping people use their energy to make their lives better. And that's not a socialist idea. It's not a conservative idea. It's just really how people get through the days. So I'm not affiliated with Democratic Socialists of America. And I don't think all of their ideas, which I've read some of them, would be terribly well received, actually. And when people say that government is not the answer to everything, I do agree with that. There are things that government can do to remove barriers. Earlier, we talked about capital gains taxes, for example, or this cap on Social Security, things like student loans and the cost of education, which is just skyrocketing. My father went to the Art Institute of Chicago on the GI Bill. That's where he met my mother. And he felt so strongly about access to education that he started a Dollars for Scholars chapter down in Bar Harbor. And I don't know if people remember Dollars for Scholars. They'd send volunteers out with paper cups and collect loose change. On a given day, a bunch of us kids would wait at the high school cafeteria and we'd sort out piles of pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters. And then my father would give out several $100 scholarships at graduation. And in those days, in the early 70s, $100 was a ton of money for a scholarship. When I went to the University of Maine, I hate to date myself, but my first year at the University of Maine, room, board, and tuition was $3,500. My daughter's last year, which was now several years ago, she's an alumni too of the university, was close to $30,000, which is pretty good. I have a colleague at the state auditor's office whose son's a very gifted student, wants to be an engineer looking at MIT or Tufts, $90,000 a year. And again, I'm not dodging the question, but I think the labels don't apply there because I have a lot of very conservative friends who feel the exact same way. These are not Democratic issues. They're not Republican issues. They're human issues, what people face every day. So aligning yourself with any one agenda or another. I mean, look, I'm a Second Amendment guy. That's led to some uncomfortable conversations at fundraisers among my more progressive friends. It's like, do you think maybe you could come around on the assault weapon issue? And it's like, look, I understand the issue frontwards and backwards, and I'll never not listen. But I also know how the process works, and what you're describing would not work. Banning assault weapons makes them very, very expensive on the private market. That's why they let the ban expire. It didn't really affect anything. And the background check issue, again, when most of your mass shooters obtained their weapons from federally licensed dealers after clearing background checks, doing a lot more of something that doesn't work very well, kind of defies the definition of common sense. So along that line, I try to solve problems. And we don't have a label of problem solver. It's progressive or conservative or socialist or whatever. So I try to avoid that. I just try to answer questions.
So if they were to endorse you, would you accept it?
It's kind of like the super PAC thing. You don't have a choice. If they endorse you, they endorse you. It's not something I'd probably embrace. I don't think it would be helpful in the 2nd District because that's not where people are. Even though some of the policies they talk about are some of the policies I talk about, like the healthcare issue. But it's always more than one policy. And I've noticed that there are people who are running for office in other parts of the country who are animal rights activists. I am not an animal rights activist. I grew up on a farm. I'm a sportsman. I respect wildlife. I respect domestic livestock. I believe it all should be treated humanely, but I don't think that a milk cow has constitutional rights. I'm sorry.
Our good friend down there in Deer Isle is very concerned about ropeless for the lobster traps. Where do you stand on that?
I think it's a terrible idea. Well, it's not a terrible idea, but this is like we have talked before about other aspects of the federal government, like not fully funding Medicaid, for example, or Maine Care, where it's like 60 or 70% of the cost. And that's why hospitals can't afford, many dentists can't afford to take Maine Care patients because they can't get their full reimbursement. If the federal government were to mandate ropeless gear, in my view, they'd have to pay for it 100%. If you do not, the average working waterfront family is not going to be able to afford that gear. There are still problems with it, which would have to be worked out. It's very, very expensive. So who would be doing the lobstering? It'd be some international conglomerate that could then make it as a venture capital thing and invest in it. And the father, son, mother, daughter team with a lobster boat would be out of business. And I think that would be really, really not only tragic, it would be so detrimental to the Maine economy because we depend an awful lot on that fishery. I think we've demonstrated in the realm of conservation that you can live side by side with an industry like fishing and the natural world. We certainly have done it inshore with our outdoor conservation programs for many, many decades. And I think we can do it on the high seas too.
Not only that, but they take away the end line from the commercial fishermen that we've spoken with, in particular NEFSA. I think this is their number one issue, is that it's a death trap for lobstermen. If they fall over, there's no way to get them back.
Lobstering is an incredibly dangerous industry. And growing up in Bar Harbor, we knew of people who died on the ocean. A friend of mine's brother was a scallop diver and got caught in the tide shift and came up too fast and died of the bends. This is real. And I think people do need to be aware it's not the same as going to the store and picking something off a shelf. When you get out in the ocean by yourself, 25 miles off, something goes wrong, it's going to go wrong fast. And anything we can do to minimize that risk through being mindful of the type of gear we're requiring, I think would be very prudent.
So as we wrap up, why should Mainers vote for you?
I think they should vote for me because I am always going to have the fact that they matter in mind. This is one of the things I heard about early on is that people felt left behind. They felt like the government didn't think they mattered. And I'm here to say the exact opposite. I got into this business because I was trying to help somebody. And I got hooked up with a state representative and he talked me into running for the legislature, and the constituent service piece is something I care deeply about. That's the stuff that never makes the news. We always talk about policy. We never talk about the curbside politics of being able to help your neighbors. And that's something I'm always going to have in mind and be available to people and hear what they have to say. We may not always agree. We may never agree, but I'm always going to listen. And I think that's really important for folks to understand that they have a voice and an ear. So that's why I hope they will vote for me.
So what's the best way for people to get involved in your campaign?
Well, we have a website. It's mattdunlapforuscongress.com. And we have a volunteer sign up. We have a donation landing spot. We have upcoming events and my positions on a few key issues, which we're going to be growing out a little bit now that we're past the primary, and can talk about some of the other things that I've done over the last 30 years besides my work in the legislature and Secretary of State more deeply, really. So we're going to be making that much more robust.
Democratic nominee for Maine's 2nd Congressional District and Maine State Auditor, Matt Dunlap. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at qpointpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.